So we were thinking about drying processes, moisture analysis. I went through some questions, I think, and should be about here. You are going to be doing, I guess, 3 of these experiments in the lab, or have done them, one of the 2. So you'll certainly get more information on. We'll gain some experience of using each of these. So one approach, so this kind of grouped into this methodology, drying ovens, other techniques, and so on. So we kind of lump them together. This is an official method using a hot air oven, drying oven. Well, this was ACCI, American Association of Cereal Chemists, I believe. And so the name has actually been changed. The cereals and grains. So the name has changed, but there are official methods. This approaches approved for your labeling purposes, legal for that matter. This is a special oven, obviously. It's not like tossing it in any oven. These ovens are designed to have uniform heating, uniform airflow through them. They're a 4-can oven. And so even heating, even circulation, so I could say don't toss it in any oven. You have a special oven that's designed for purpose. The sample, of course, may have already been partially dried. Maybe it's a liquid. You don't want to toss it in there. It'll boil over perhaps. And so there may be some drying that's done firsthand and done carefully. And then once it gets to a certain point, you toss it I should say toss. You put it in the oven gently, okay, and somewhere around 18 to 24 hours later, it will probably be taken out like the desiccator. And so this is a fairly common range. You use something like that time for the drying. The volatile compounds will evaporate if they're more volatile than water, or in that if they're volatile, they're going to go away. So you don't have a lot of volatile compounds in most cases in your foods. This is kind of a minor one. If you look at something like flavors, they are volatile, but oftentimes their usage level is 0.1%. So again, this idea of weight loss due to evaporation of volatile compounds, like pretty much going on. But you do have a potential of overheating and getting browning, and again, browning will result in some loss of compounds, decomposition, other chemical reactions that will occur. So it is fairly high temperature and you get some degradation. So we will lose a little bit of weight here. The idea, have you pre-dried it somewhat so it doesn't splatter, or will it still splatter even though it's pre-dried? You have to be conscious of that. And sometimes you have a lid over them, not necessarily a tight lid, but some kind of screen or whatever that prevents splattering. I think almost every time, the first time anybody does this, and they open up the oven and the nice cool air goes in and it blows powder all over. So you tend to normalize your samples, right, by mixing them. So you learn to be fairly careful, allowing it to cool adequately, and not opening a hot oven, and being, like I say, careful that when the air rushes in, you don't just blow everything out of your pants. So you have to be careful there. This is a drying oven and so that speeds things up. This is another driving force for evaporation. And so you might get along with a little lower temperature, a little less time perhaps, if you're in a vacuum oven. So you get less degradation of the product, probably less artifacts when you use a vacuum oven. Again, this is an official method. No there. And so I guess that's kind of redundant here, down here. That's drying lower temperature. There is some concern about if you're getting as good heat transfer and uniform heating in this type of oven. That is a note on even distribution of heat potentially. And so again, when you do all of these things and you become familiar with the method, you spend a little bit of time trying them and run some duplicates. What kind of variation do I see in the methodology? And then you gain somewhat of a better feeling for that. If you put 4 different samples, or 4 of the same sample in the oven in different places, you all get the same results. You feel pretty good about it. Okay, good. I didn't have a problem with the oven. It's going to work. It's going to give me the data. Volatile compounds, yes, they will evaporate. Now we've got a driving force of the vacuum. That's even more of a driving force for anything that's volatile in that sample to evaporate. This doesn't need a water trap. That water trap very commonly is just a dryer, right? It goes in a typical desiccator. And what happens, of course, you're losing water here. It's evaporating, which is what you want. It then goes over from, okay, we've got to have our oven over here. So it goes into the moisture trap, and that can be filled with either this dry, like commonly. Sometimes you actually use a liquid nitrogen chilled freezer, just a full flask with the air through. Because they're going to be pulling moisture up here. You don't want moisture in the pump. So if you're working with a vacuum system, you have to be really conscious that you do have a trap, either a liquid nitrogen trap or a dry trap that goes in here and protects that pump from that pump will get water in it, and you won't have a pump anymore. So you have to be very careful about that. So the other one, you don't have any pump. The previous one, this one, you do have a pump to form the vacuum. So definitely needed. Both methods, first and the second, are fairly time consuming. The one with the vacuum is a little faster, obviously. But still, it's a fair amount of time that goes into drying these products. You don't get quick results. It's quite a long process. If you say, hey, let's speed this up a little bit, let's look at methods that are a little faster. We may be doing it in process control. We want to keep track of its being a food as it's being produced or as it's being dried or processed. Well, okay, we can't wait to keep 24 hours for something for information to come back. And so you want something quick. That's where microwaves come in. We're all familiar with microwaves, very fast heating. And so the analysis can be somewhere 4 to 8 minutes. This is the example analysis time of the process. And so there may be a bit of a problem that this is, of course, we get heating. Some foods will heat more than others. The food can actually get fairly hot as it's in the microwave ovens, and that can cause some degradation to it. So if there aren't errors in the system, poor heat distribution, wherever you've got something that absorbs microwave, that it's hot. And so it may be hot in some places and not so hot in other places. So not as uniform. The sample should be uniform. It should be centered in the oven. And you should have an idea of the amount of time that you're going to be running this analysis. It is an official method for some products, tomato products, meat and poultry, but in general, it isn't an official method. The drying oven, the first 2 types, drying oven and vacuum oven are official methods very generally. Much faster, has a purpose. Let's get a quick determination. Are we going the way we think we should? And again, so certain products it works well for. So our whole goal, right, is to evaporate water. That's what we're doing in each of these cases. So it's just oven, it's then got oven heating and another vacuum. And so the microwave exactly does the heating. Well, we can also heat by infrared. If you're in the food processing class and doing the agglomeration laboratory, you should be getting a moisture content on that product as it's being agglomerated. And so downstairs, we'll just have a little infrared system just like this. You put your sample into the pan, you do a weighing on it, it's a scale, so we put it measure weight. You close the lid, and then you have an infrared that heats this. We watch the weight window to where the weight you can have it constantly being weighed. This infrared light heats it, evaporates the moisture, so you have moisture contents or weight drops and then levels off, and there's no more moisture, then we stop it. And you can get a moisture content again, fairly, really quite quickly. Not an official method, a little bit too much variation in it. How long do you heat that? What kind of control do you have? So it's again something you might use in production processing and follow what's going along, but you won't use it for a final accurate measurement of moisture in the product. So infrared lamp, very high sample temperature. Infrared lamp is hot, then you get some potential sample degradation. Depends upon the sample you're running. Staying with rapid moisture, okay, we can heat in other ways. Halogen heaters. Okay, this is basically the same as we were looking at for so food processing labs. The halogen heater, so we get a heater, we get a metal or Chelino balance. There can be other types of heating. It doesn't have to be an infrared lamp. Different ways to heat that sample, but again, it works much the same way. So that balance, we have a way to heat a sample there. So different kind of designs, different ways to do the heating. That gets us out of methodology. I'm kind of smiling, going back to the Dark Ages here for a moment. That's why I'm smiling to myself. There are other ways to do this that aren't necessarily quick. They aren't necessarily as easy, but they're absolutely as accurate. And if you're someplace and some startup that was not a lot of funds, this is really pretty cheap. And most people can run it. You put your sample down here. You mix your sample with a solvent. I don't know if I mentioned which solvent, toluene, for example. Then you start then, so it could be a powder, it could be anything real. Put your toluene down here and you start heating the toluene. Toluene will carry some water with it. And so the toluene will carry water with it. Come up here, condense as it cools. That toluene isn't going to like that water. Water is heavier than toluene, so water starts building up. So as this is refluxing, the water tends to be collected here, and the toluene returns this little bit of water comes back up. That's pretty cheap method of doing moisture determination. And it's absolutely correct. There's not a problem with it. Well, measure, it's a volumetric measurement. Not commonly used. Why is it not commonly used? Because it takes time. But again, if you're in some situation where you don't have money, it gets you a number and it gets you an accurate number. Carl Fisher is one that is really broadly used. Has anyone here used a Carl Fisher for moisture determination? Anything? No. Okay. It is really one of the more common methods. I guess you will be doing that in the laboratory. It is an official method of choice on primarily low moisture foods. So dried fruits, vegetables, candies, chocolate. Again, low moisture foods or foods high in sugar or high in protein is where, again, the food shines very, very nicely. It is rapid, it doesn't take long. We'll go through another slide to give a little more detail. But it's a fairly rapid methodology, but you can only do one at a time. It isn't like an oven where you can put 20 samples in and go away and come back and have them done for you. So quick, but one at a time. It is accurate, but it's best used for low moisture and low fat foods. So performs best in low moisture, low fat. It isn't quite as accurate for mid moisture foods, so intermediate moisture foods. And it takes a little longer to titrate. So it's a little slower, less accurate for intermediate moisture foods. Great, like say, low moisture. High fats. There can be a problem with high fat products or high, and especially if those fats are oxidizable. So if they're oxidizing, the oxidation products will react with the reagent, just like water does. And so you'll get some error in the method if the food happens to be high fat and fairly well oxidized. We'll count oxidation as moisture content. It is a titration. The iodine gets involved in this measurement. Methanol or pyridine is commonly used as a solvent. We normally use methanol. It should be anhydrous. It should be maintained anhydrous, obviously. Methanol and water are quite miscible. It's gonna, if you've got that reagent bottle open, it's gonna pick up moisture from the room and it's gonna be giving incorrect data. So you get anhydrous methanol or anhydrous pyridine, and you basically put your sample into this solvent and you allow a certain, stopper, and then you allow it to extract, well, perhaps up to 18 hours. So that might be something you do overnight for that matter. So you put your dry, semi-dry product in there. We use it very broadly for encapsulated foods. We kind of powdered ingredients that are going to the food industry. And so basically the anhydrous methanol picks up that water. Your starting methanol is used as a blank. So if there is some water in the methanol, that's your blank, and here's your sample being determined. So it's the difference between the two. And so basically you do a titration method, you titrate the excess iodine present. So what iodine isn't reacted is what we measure, and then by difference, you come up with a sample moisture content. So very commonly used, very convenient for that matter. Must be titrated with a standard Carl Fisher reagent. So I just don't remember doing that. Maybe it comes standardized at this point, so if you don't have to do it. I don't recall that, but they say you must make sure that your reagents are anhydrous in the first place. So I guess you'd have to look into that. So make sure the reagents are dry, make sure your methanol, your extracting material is also dry. And again, you can do some standardization. You can check it out by adding known amount of water to something, have it extracted, and see that you get accurate results. This is a diagram of it. And so it looks fairly complicated, but it's much less complicated than it appears. This is an automatic one, so it'll do the taking in your solvent with your sample, and you'll get moisture determination directly from the machine. If you go through something that's a manual, it ends up being much more complicated, where you have your sample down here, you have your reagents in here, where you pump in your sample, get some mixing, and ultimately it gets titrated to come up with a moisture determination. I was going to ask if you haven't done any of these yet, have you? Okay. So you will get a chance to run. Again, other approaches, there are many ways to do this. One is looking at electrical conductivity. A dry powder won't conduct much electricity, the poor conductor. The more moisture is there, the better conductor it is, electricity. So basically, you can monitor the ability of the food to transmit electrical current. And through this process, you can again measure the amount of water in the sample. And so you'll actually have to build a standard curve for it. So you take your food, whatever you want to measure, compare it with different moisture contents and get a standard curve for it. Then you can read your dielectric constant and you can read out the direct moisture content. So again, one more method to look at. How many of you have ever used a hydrometer? I'll be darned. Okay. This is again, what were you using it for?
Measuring like change in sugars in beer, alcohol.
Okay, sure. Good applications. We're in the same one.
Yeah, I've also used it for sugars and like sorbets. So like
Mhm.
you're making before you put it in the freezer, you want to make sure you have the right sugar ratio.
It's very simple methodology as well. You basically have a pycnometer. That pycnometer has a certain volume and a certain weight. And so you can determine the density of the liquid, and the density of the liquid will be determined by the amount of solids present. So you're basically getting a solids constant. Water is similar. Certainly one way, well, subtracting one. And so you'll find that this will float at different levels. If you've got a lot of solids, high solids, you're going to find that it floats higher. And so you can read off very different numbers, and that will give you the specific gravity of the liquid that you're measuring. So it's really a simple methodology. With freezing point determination, some things like this, that's also very useful. We used to use that commonly in the pilot plant. I'm not sure they're quite as skilled with using the pilot plant today because it's less. But compare specific gravity examples to that water at the same temperature. Archimedes' principle, that's a solid spent liquid will be buoyed by a force, which is the weight of the liquid displaced. So Archimedes' principle, it basically depends upon the density or specific gravity of the solution. Standardized glass square, well, they'll have different scales on them. They'll be used for different different density materials, different moisture content materials. So again, a very simple. If you have your sample, you can put the hydrometer in there, see where it floats, and read off what is sugar content or other material. Refractive index based on bending of light, that is the surface of the product. Again, you may be familiar, have used this in one way or another. Look at refractive index, how much is this refractive as it goes through the liquid. Of course, there's reactive as well. But again, it's a very simple way. Refractive index is dependent upon the moisture content of many foods. And so having constant temperature, using, again, a very constant light source, you can use refractive index to measure moisture content in the product. There's a bunch of methods you kind of pick up that are used for moisture. Another one is freezing point. Freezing point is actually used in milk, looking for the adulteration of milk. How might milk be adulterated? A farmer could be adding water to it. And so that's always checked. The way the standard method that's doing it, which is a sample of milk, actually gets put into a cryoscope over here, and a cryoscope will go ahead and pull this in. And you will end up getting a freezing point. And so basically, based on the freezing point, you can say whether or not it's been adulterated with water. The FDA rejects milk with a freezing point higher than this. Remember, any added solids tend to lower the freezing point. So if it's pure water, this is going to be 0 degrees centigrade. As there's increase in solids content, your freezing point drops. And so it's a very accurate, quick method tool.
Would you just like add water and then add more solids to reduce it again?
Probably. Take a little sugar, sweetens it up a little bit, and go for it. It's because all you're doing is measuring the, basically a freezing point. add a little ethanol to it, spice up the day a little bit. Okay. So yeah, why do people like milk from this particular farm? I don't know. Everybody just loves that milk. A little bit of ethanol added to it or something. Well, Dr. Ismail suggested you look at, become familiar with table 15, chapter 15, table 5, because I guess it's a comparison of methodologies. So anyway, lots of techniques, lots of methodologies to measure water content. Some are better than others, some are more accurate, some are faster, some are more appropriate for given foods than others. So it isn't like one shoe fits all. You'll have different techniques for different food products. You may want something that's very fast, but doesn't have to be so accurate. Okay, that's really a different set of requirements. So again, you don't just randomly choose a methodology. It's chosen thinking about what's approved for that purpose or what works best for that particular product. So that's kind of methodology to look at moisture content. The other thing that I think we mentioned, you're well aware of, is water activity. So you measure water, but you also are interested in measuring the water activity often. Because again, water activity tends to be rather important to us in many ways. And basically, there's a stability map. I think it's actually something Ted Belusa published a while ago. And so it kind of gives you an idea of what's the water activity of dry foods. And they're mostly foods that are in the range of 0 to 0.35 water activity. And that water activity, remember, runs from 0 to 1. 1 is pure water, 0 water. And so the food will have a different water activity depending on how free that water is, how much water is there, and how free that water is to be evaporated, to be occupying headspace of the product. And so dry foods, fried snack chips, powders, freeze-dried foods, they tend to be very low water activity, around 0 to 0.35. And so that kind of takes care of the really dry products. When we get up at intermediate moisture foods, that's in the range of 0.35 to 0.75. And what are some examples? Nutrition bars, chewing gum, honey, raisins, fruit snacks, mini candies, beef jerky. So kind of in the intermediate moisture range, not dry, not wet. We get over here, so many of our foods are actually higher water activity, fresh meats, fruits, vegetables, dairy, and they're typically water activity greater than 0.3. So we're down in this range. We've got something that's kind of dry, crispy, very hard in comparison. As we go up, of course, we get less crispness. So when we lose the crispness, it ends up being chewy. When we get into this area, of course, we're talking about liquids or syrups and that. And so different kind of categories that are determined or defined by the water activity of the product. This, of course, gets you into, to some extent, so what? You have a water activity this, what does that mean? Chemically for that food, but it's kind of defined it physically. It's a physical change in the food. But when we're in very, very dry systems down here, oxidation tends to go up. If you think about lipid oxidation of a food product, it's the most stable in this range. So if it's a dry product or semi-dry product, here's where we like to be if our product was going to oxidize with a potential problem of oxidation. We'd like to have a water activity in this range. As we go up in water activity, the rate again tends to increase until it's really dilute. And then as it is more and more dilute, there's less oxidation. So water activity is important to us in terms of shelf life of product, stability of products. Another very important reaction, of course, is Maillard browning. So the browning reaction. And this follows quite a different relationship. What we're looking at here, of course, is reducing sugar, reacting with a protein primarily. So we're looking at protein reducing sugar reactions, basically the amine of the protein. And so at very, very low water activities, there isn't much mobility. So we got a sugar here, we have a protein here, but they can't move to each other. It's so dry. You don't get easy migration through that food product. And so the rate slows down. As we go to slightly higher water activities, basically it follows the idea of moisture content too. The reaction rate increases. It increases more and more mobility, easier for the sugar to get to the protein, easier for the reaction to occur. And at some point, that basically then starts declining in line because it's getting dilute. More and more water, more and more dilute, more difficult for the sugar to find a protein. And of course, our other issue is microbial growth. We find a lot of intermediate moisture foods. We get down in this category. At this point, the manufacturer doesn't worry about microbial stability. They don't worry about pathogens. They're not going to grow in the product when you have a dry product. And kind of even a center of intermediate moisture product, you won't get microbial growth. But we get up into this category, certainly we're finding somewhere around here, so something 7.5, whatever. We're starting to get some microorganisms that grow. And we just simply go better and better. The more moisture there is up until the point where it's diluted. So water activity is something that's very, very important to us. It defines product character, some of its properties, such as chewiness, crispness. It certainly determines or defines the stability, shelf life of product in many ways. And so we're very interested in determining water activity. So moisture content is one thing. Water activity is a difference. And this is, again, kind of the idea that differentiating between the two, between water activity and moisture content. But you basically find is that the bigger the molecules, the less influence they will have on water activity. Small molecules, what do we add? When we add antifreeze, very, very small molecules, lots of them. They kind of get in the way of the water, get in the way of the water reacting, and so on. And so small molecules, we can do a very good job reducing water activity and having a good shelf life to the product. Large molecules, we have to have much less water. We have to be much drier than what we think of sugar, sweetener, other products. And so we really want to differentiate between the two. And they can have almost the same moisture content and have two very different water activities because it depends on what's the solid material in there. This is a little bit redundant in a sense that kind of was mentioned back a little bit earlier. When we're down at a water activity of 0.2 to 0.3, remember this runs from 0 to 1. 0 is extremely dry, 1 is a very big block of moisture, 3 moisture. If you water activity 0.2 to 0.3, it's about that being the monolayer. That kind of every molecule is covered with a little bit of water. It's protected. It's tied up. So that water is not free to go anywhere. It's not to catalyze anything, to be used by anything. So your product is extremely stable. Microbial growth, chemical reactions, whatever, at this low water activity. When we get down a little bit higher, 0.35 to 0.4, we start losing crispness, so texture changes. And so if it was crisp, now it's become chewy as it goes into the change. 0.3 to 0.4 actually starts getting sticky in terms of texture. 0.55 Hardening soft materials, that's kind of interesting. At some point, the material, this can be sticky, it'll get hard at this point. This onset of microbial growth was lowest 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, maximum chemical reactions, 0.85 pathogen growth. Up here, microbiological storage. So manufacturers worry a lot about water activity. It is extremely important to them what that water activity is, and defining chemical reactions and microbial growth. So water activity range from 0 to 1. Measure the amount of moisture in the equilibrated headspace above a food product. So you're not measuring the water activity. You are measuring the water activity in the food, but if you put it in a closed chamber, that moisture content down there will come to equilibrium in the headspace. And so you measure what moisture is in the headspace, not the food itself. So measure the amount of moisture in equilibrated headspace above the sample of food. And you can do this different ways. Very commonly, you have an automated system that you put your food in there, you allow it to come to equilibrium, and then there's an automated way to measure the moisture in the headspace of the food itself. So allow it to equilibrate and then determine the humidity up there. And these are things that have to be controlled. Size of container that's coming to equilibrium, amount of sample, time, temperature, and then calibration system as well. So again, it's a number of different ways to go ahead and do this determination. And these are some examples. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to measure the moisture in the headspace, the airspace above a sample. The most common, or these are probably the two most common. This has been the most common dew points. So we'll measure. We're talking about both of these coming up. So dew point measurement, that's basically determining the temperature at which you get condensation. So when is that humidity above the sample start cooling a glass plate actually? And when you start getting condensation, the machine will detect, oops, starting to condense. So you kind of cool it enough to get condensation. And from that condensation temperature, we know the humidity of the sample. And there's ways to also look at electrical conductivity. But again, there's a large number of other methodologies. And some of these others used to be very popular. These tend to dominate at this point. So most popular, but also possible. At one time were used because there probably wasn't a really good way to do it otherwise. And so if you're kind of looking at the system, so here's your food sample. You've got a nice temperature control, so your food sample gets up to the temperature it should. You have to have a closed system. You have a closed system, so your headspace up here, and food, the moisture comes to equilibrium. So your equilibrium relative humidity. And then you need some way to measure that humidity. What's the humidity here? And the one I mentioned was just a chilled mirror. And you're looking at that chilled mirror, reflecting light very nicely. Whoops, we start getting condensation. It doesn't reflect light anymore in the same way. So this chilled mirror changes the ability to conduct light and says, okay, that's the temperature. So if we know a temperature at which we get condensation, we know the humidity. I hope that makes sense. There's that's I say the most common, but there are other ways to look at some hygroscopic materials that will change electrical conductivity. So it can be very simple methodologies or fairly complicated. These are some common foods. Potato chips, the water activity 0.07. It's crispy, it's dry, it's stable, not a problem in the world. It'll oxidize, okay. There's a problem. But again, from a water activity standpoint, hard candies down here, crisp cookies. Crisp cookie 0.25 water activity, chewy cookie 0.55. Okay. Or you go from crispy cookie to chewy cookie. Think about that if you're a cookie baker. You know, how does it turn out soft? Does it turn out hard? Why does it turn out hard and crispy? And why do they turn out chewy? It's all basically in the composition of that cookie and the moisture content. Again, high fructose corn syrup or 0.75 condensed milk, soy sauce, salted butter. You got a real variety of data here, giving examples of typical water activities of foods. These are water activity of various sugar solutions. I assume that's at saturation. That's really water activity. So above them. Things that are very, very soluble will tend to give us fairly high. I'm sorry, things that are soluble have low water activities. So fructose, malic acid, very soluble. They put a lot of them in, they tend to decrease the water, they take out some water. So that's interesting. But over here, it's something to keep in mind. These are saturated solutions. I don't know if you've been in a laboratory often enough, but if you walk through the laboratory, oftentimes you'll find a whole bunch of desiccators. So there'll be the round desiccators, and you should take a look at them. They'll typically be labeled, one might be lithium chloride, magnesium chloride, sodium chloride, and so on. And what basically those desiccators are doing is that people want to adjust their sample. They have a sample of food product. They want to adjust the water activity to look at maybe chemical reaction. What chemical reactions are going to occur in my food? Well, these chemical reactions are influenced by the water activity. And so very commonly we'll set up experiments where you can take a food product. And again, you can look at these plant proteins, say, hey, does my plant protein going to react with sugar? Am I going to get there drawing? What would it changes occur? In my business, I'm interested in the reaction of flavor compounds with proteins. And so we oftentimes, I think one of the things that warmed my heart more than many things lately is that I got a call from one of my PhD graduates. And he said, Gary, I'm working in the flavor industry. And a customer came in and we developed a flavor for them for this high energy protein beverage. And he said they absolutely loved it. And then they sterilized it so they could sell it. Then it turned into garbage. It turned into garbage. It stunk, it precipitated, and it got hazy. And all of that happened because of the protein reacting with the flavor compounds, just like they react with sugars, drowning, same type of it. And so this whole idea of understanding these reactions with the water activity, we run experiments all the time if there were water activities. Why could this be a problem? Could this reaction be a problem of the protein and sugar here, 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 here? So again, having the ability to set up samples at different humidities, come to equilibrium, gives you a good way to do research that's really needed in the industry.
I have a question. When we matter is and in between. When we were visited on a cookie, which has the in between the two. So the Washington had not that the cream has higher moisture. The cream has lower. Still, it won't cover from giving this.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting where you've got a cookie like a high-end cookie or something where you got those dark chocolate, dry, crispy shell or layer. Then got a cream filling, which is very soft. Hey, wait a minute, that must be high with moisture. It's going to make it soggy.
Yeah.
It really doesn't. Why? Because your cookie itself is a lot of solids, but they're high molecular weight solids. High molecular weight solids don't influence water activity that much. So that cookie shell, we call that, may have a water activity of 0.5, 0.6. And look at that cream filling, there's a lot of simple sugars in it. And that simple sugar really drops down that water activity. So they can have exactly the same water activities. And one is kind of a soft creamy, and the other one is a crispy creamy. And that's just composition of the product. And they worry about that. They don't want to make a crispy cookie with a soggy interior. You know, then that's by the time the customer gets it, it's horrible. So, yeah. But that's a nice example of I was having to think about water activity. Well, this is basically the experiment that I was mentioning. You know, go ahead and run experiments at different water activities, get an idea of reaction rates, and be aware of when the product is going to be stable or unstable. This talks about moisture analysis, common uses. So again, there's a table, gives you some guidance for where methodologies are used and what are good examples of it. And this is the idea of plotting a relationship, determining the relationship between composition of a product and moisture content. So again, you can better understand water activity and what to expect. And so there's all kinds of factors that go into determining the relative humidity of that product or the water activity of that product. And so what oftentimes is done is an isotherm is constructed. So you have some kind of a composition, whether it's a cookie or not, and you can kind of look at changing the moisture content in that product to different water activities and take a look at how that relates back to water content. So you draw relationships between water and its freedom through water activity. And having this kind of information on a feed cup is very helpful. You want it crispy, you want it soggy, you want it liquid. So again, you'll find again a lot of these called isotherms are developed for different products to know how the texture will change, how their chemical microbial stability will change. And again, useful in terms of product development. You can do these in automated approaches. You can do them by hand. And it's interesting, you start off a very dry product, and then you have it pick up moisture. So you get to these different relative humidities. When you get up here, then you reverse it and start dropping the water to it. So dry it out. Here you're adding water, here you're drying it out, but it's the same product. And it doesn't follow the same line. So again, are you measuring the water content as a function of gaining water or losing water? So again, things to be conscious of. And if you end up in research, you'll become sorely aware of this. How's that? And our automated system, that's the neat things. We don't live in the dark ages anymore. And so they can put these into an instrument and they will go through a series of steps of increasing humidity and then so to gain moisture and to drop moisture, and you can generate isotherms for products. So water activity is extremely important to the company, to the product, to the consumer. And so having the ability to measure and understand it is very, very useful. So there's a comment about if you haven't, it should be. Then you're going to have a lab on many of these. I hope this is still accurate of that. But you will be using different methodologies, and you will be determining the relative humidity. So that's it. Minute over, not bad. Okay. Anyway, have a nice day. It's beautiful out there. You probably noticed that.